It began as something no one in Onondaga County thought twice about. A quiet file in a system filled with louder tragedies. A domestic loss that fit neatly into a familiar pattern. In late 2001, the Bennett family lived a life that, from the outside, looked stable enough to pass without scrutiny. Rachel Bennett managed the household with a steady routine, while her husband, Thomas Bennett, moved through his days under a growing weight that few people fully understood. They had 2 daughters who relied on the fragile structure of that home, unaware that it was already beginning to fracture in ways that would soon become irreversible. Then, in November 2001, the timeline abruptly stopped. Thomas was found unresponsive inside the home. Emergency response followed standard procedure, and within hours, the conclusion was documented. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack. For official records, the explanation was sufficient. There were no immediate signs that demanded further investigation, no visible disruption that suggested anything beyond a sudden medical event. The case did not move beyond routine classification, but outside the formal conclusion, doubt took hold. Thomas was 38 years old. He had no known history of severe cardiac illness that would explain such a sudden end. Among those who knew him best, the explanation did not align with the man they had seen only days before. His sister, Caroline Bennett, pressed for an autopsy, believing that something about the situation did not fit. The request, however, did not move forward. Rachel declined to authorize further examination, stating that Thomas would not have wanted his body subjected to that process. Without legal grounds to override the decision, the matter closed. The absence of deeper investigation left a quiet gap, one that would not be filled for years. In the months that followed, Rachel collected a life insurance payout totaling $55,000. The financial resolution brought a sense of closure to the official narrative, allowing the case to settle into the background. For local authorities, there was nothing that required reopening. For the community, it remained a personal tragedy, one more story absorbed into the larger flow of ordinary life. Time moved forward. By early 2003, Rachel had begun rebuilding her life. She met Daniel Harper, a man who had already formed his own path before entering hers. Their relationship developed quickly, leading to marriage in August of that year. The new household formed under practical decisions rather than emotional alignment. Daniel did not intend to step into a parental role for Rachel's daughters. The boundary was clear from the beginning, shaping the dynamic of the family into separate parallel lines rather than a unified structure. That separation did not immediately collapse the marriage, but it established a foundation of tension that would persist. The household functioned, but it never stabilized. Expectations remained unfulfilled, and the distance between individuals continued to widen in subtle ways. By the time 2005 approached, the pattern had already been set. What remained unseen was how closely the past and the present were about to converge. At that point, no one in the system connected the 2 phases of Rachel Bennett's life. There was no formal link between Thomas's death and the new marriage that followed. The earlier case remained closed, its details preserved only in archived records. The second chapter had not yet drawn attention, and the timeline still appeared as a sequence of unrelated events. But the structure was already in place. A marriage that ended in unresolved questions. A second marriage forming under strain. A history that had not been fully examined. Each element existed independently, waiting for a moment when they would align in a way that could no longer be ignored. That moment had not yet arrived, but it was approaching. And when it did, the quiet certainty that defined the first death would begin to unravel, piece by piece, into something far more deliberate than anyone had first believed. The official explanation settled quickly, almost too quickly for something that had altered the course of an entire family. By the end of November 2001, Thomas Bennett's death had already been processed through the system and reduced to a single line in a report. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. For Rachel Bennett, the conclusion created a boundary. On one side was the life she had shared with Thomas, strained and unresolved, marked by years of instability. On the other side was something new, something undefined, but already beginning to take shape. The official cause of death allowed that transition to happen without resistance. There were no active investigations, no legal complications, no delays that might have forced the past to remain present. But outside the official process, the questions did not disappear. Caroline Bennett, Thomas's sister, held on to a different understanding of what had happened. She revisited the timeline repeatedly, not because there was clear evidence of wrongdoing, but because the explanation never aligned with what she knew of her brother. The suddenness of his death, combined with his age, created a gap that could not be filled by a standard diagnosis. She requested an autopsy with the expectation that it would bring clarity, even if it confirmed the original conclusion. That request never moved forward. Rachel's refusal remained final. The explanation she provided was simple and consistent. Thomas would not have wanted further examination. Without legal grounds to challenge that decision, the request stalled and eventually dissolved. There was no escalation, no intervention from authorities, and no mechanism to force a deeper look. The system moved on. The absence of an autopsy became one of the most important details in the entire timeline, but at that moment it carried no visible weight. It was just another decision made during a period of loss, one that seemed personal rather than strategic. Only later would it be understood as something more deliberate. In the weeks that followed, the administrative side of Thomas's death continued. Insurance documentation was processed, verified, and approved. The policy attached to his name resulted in a payout of $55,000. The transfer of funds marked a final step in closing the case from a financial perspective. Everything connected to his life, at least within official systems, had been accounted for. For Rachel, that resolution created stability. There were no outstanding claims, no disputes, no legal barriers. The structure of her life shifted into something that could be managed again. The focus turned toward the future, toward maintaining a sense of continuity for her daughters, and toward rebuilding what had been disrupted. From the outside, it appeared as a process of recovery, the expected path after a sudden loss. Time moved forward without interruption. By early 2002, the memory of Thomas's death had already begun to settle into the past for most people outside the immediate family. There were no headlines, no ongoing attention, no reason for authorities to revisit the case. It remained categorized as a natural death, filed and stored among countless others that followed similar patterns. But within that quiet resolution, something remained unresolved. The lack of a full medical explanation created a gap that could not be formally addressed anymore. Without an autopsy, there was no detailed analysis of what had actually occurred inside Thomas's body. The official cause remained broad, based on surface-level indicators rather than comprehensive testing. That limitation did not trigger concern within the system, but it left behind an absence of certainty. Caroline continued to question it, but her concerns did not translate into action. There was no new evidence, no procedural pathway to reopen the case, and no authority willing to challenge the original conclusion. Over time, even her doubts were forced into silence, not because they had been resolved, but because there was no place for them to go. Rachel's life continued to evolve. As 2002 progressed, the focus shifted entirely away from what had happened in November of the previous year. The routines of daily life returned, gradually replacing the disruption caused by Thomas's death. Responsibilities remained, decisions continued, and the future began to take shape again. From every visible angle, the transition appeared complete. There was no indication at that point that the story had not ended. No one connected the unresolved questions from 2001 to anything that might happen next. There was no reason to draw a line between that quiet conclusion and the events that were still ahead. The case remained closed, its details untouched, its significance underestimated. But the absence of answers did not mean the absence of truth. It only meant that the truth had not yet been forced into the open. And as the timeline moved closer to 2003, the conditions that had allowed Thomas Bennett's death to pass without deeper examination were still in place, unchanged, waiting to intersect with a new chapter that would begin under entirely different circumstances, yet carry the same hidden structure beneath it. That sense of closure created space for something new. It was during this period that Rachel met Daniel Harper. He entered her life at a time when she was no longer defined by the immediate aftermath of loss. Daniel had already built his own structure before crossing paths with her. He had children from a previous relationship and carried with him a set of boundaries shaped by his past. Their connection developed quickly, moving from familiarity into commitment within a relatively short period of time. By August 2003, the two were married. The formation of this new household did not follow the traditional expectation of blending into a unified family. From the beginning, Daniel made it clear that he did not intend to take on the role of a father figure for Rachel's daughters. This was not presented as a temporary adjustment or something that might change over time. It was a fixed position, one that defined how the household would function moving forward. Rachel accepted that structure, but the implications of that decision began to surface gradually. Within the family, the lines were clear but not comfortable. Responsibilities were divided in a way that kept emotional distance intact. Daniel focused on maintaining his own sense of independence within the marriage, while Rachel continued to manage the needs of her daughters without his involvement. There was no open conflict that forced immediate attention, but there was no integration either. The absence of connection became its own form of tension. Over time, that tension settled into the background, becoming part of the rhythm of daily life. By late 2004, the marriage had established its pattern. There were no major disruptions, no events that demanded outside intervention, and no clear signs that anything was fundamentally wrong from an external perspective. To neighbors, acquaintances, and anyone observing from a distance, the household functioned within the range of what might be considered normal. The earlier chapter involving Thomas remained separate, unconnected to this new phase. But the structure beneath the surface had not changed. The same conditions that had allowed Thomas's death to pass without deeper scrutiny were still present. There was no heightened awareness, no ongoing monitoring, and no reason for authorities to revisit anything connected to Rachel's past. The system had moved on, and with it, any possibility of linking one chapter to another. That absence of connection became critical. As 2005 approached, the dynamic within the Harper household remained consistent. Daniel maintained his distance from Rachel's daughters, reinforcing the boundaries that had been set at the beginning. Rachel continued to navigate the responsibilities of the household within that framework. There was no visible escalation, no single moment that marked a shift from stability to crisis. Instead, everything continued along a steady, unremarkable path. Then, in August 2005, the timeline changed again. Rachel contacted emergency services with a report that immediately drew attention. She stated that Daniel had isolated himself in the bedroom and was no longer responding. The call was processed with urgency, and law enforcement was dispatched to the residence. Upon arrival, the situation presented itself as a potential medical emergency or a personal crisis contained within a private space. Access to the room was forced. Inside, Daniel Harper was found unresponsive. What followed began as a standard procedural response. The scene was secured, and initial observations were documented. At first, there was nothing that clearly separated this situation from other cases involving sudden death within a private residence. The framework for understanding the event was still forming, still aligned with the expectation of a personal or medical cause. But then the details began to emerge. Investigators noted the presence of a container that did not belong in that context. A bottle of automotive antifreeze had been left open. Nearby, 2 drinking glasses were positioned in a way that suggested recent use. One contained a liquid consistent with juice. The other showed signs of containing something else. That combination introduced a different possibility. As the scene was processed, the initial classification began to shift. What had started as a routine response now required a closer look. The presence of a toxic substance changed the direction of the investigation, forcing authorities to consider scenarios beyond natural causes or isolated personal actions. The medical examination confirmed the critical detail. Daniel Harper's system contained antifreeze. At that moment, the case moved into a different category. The assumption of a simple personal tragedy was no longer sufficient. However, the question of how the substance had been consumed remained unresolved. There was no immediate evidence that pointed directly to another individual. The environment did not provide a clear answer, and the timeline surrounding Daniel's final hours was still incomplete. Rachel's account became central to the investigation. She explained that she had provided Daniel with a glass of cranberry juice before he separated himself. That explanation accounted for one of the glasses found at the scene. The second glass, the one associated with antifreeze, remained unaccounted for in her narrative. She maintained that she had no involvement with it, presenting the situation as something that had occurred without her knowledge. At that point, the case stood on uncertain ground. There was evidence of poisoning, but no direct proof of who had introduced it. The circumstances allowed for multiple interpretations, and without a clear contradiction, Rachel's account could not be immediately dismissed. The investigation continued, but the direction it would take had not yet fully formed. What remained consistent, however, was the pattern. Another sudden death, another closed environment, another explanation that depended on limited evidence. And once again, the system faced a situation where the truth existed just beyond what could be proven in that moment. The presence of antifreeze in Daniel Harper's system changed the classification of his death, but it did not immediately provide clarity. In August 2005, the investigation entered a phase defined by uncertainty rather than conclusion. The evidence pointed to poisoning, yet the circumstances surrounding how it happened remained incomplete. There was no direct witness, no clear sequence that could be reconstructed without relying on Rachel Bennett's account. Her explanation became the central framework. Rachel stated that she had prepared a glass of cranberry juice for Daniel earlier that morning. That detail aligned with one of the two glasses found in the room. It established a simple, understandable interaction that fit within the structure of daily life. The second glass, however, introduced a complication. It contained traces consistent with antifreeze, a substance that had no place in any normal domestic routine. Rachel denied any knowledge of how that substance entered the situation. Without a contradiction that could be supported by physical evidence, investigators were left with a limited set of options. The possibility that Daniel had consumed the substance on his own could not be ruled out. There were no immediate signs of forced involvement, no indications that another person had introduced the chemical in a way that could be definitively proven. The case existed in a space where suspicion was present, but proof was absent. The medical findings reinforced the complexity. Antifreeze poisoning is not subtle. It produces a sequence of internal reactions that are severe and progressive. The presence of the substance confirmed that Daniel's death was not natural, but it did not identify intent or responsibility. Investigators examined the available evidence, including the placement of the glasses and the open container, but the scene did not provide a clear narrative that excluded self-administration. Rachel's position remained consistent throughout questioning. She acknowledged preparing the juice. She denied any involvement with the antifreeze. She presented the situation as something that had occurred outside of her awareness, something that developed after Daniel had separated himself. The timeline she described did not contain an obvious contradiction that could be used to challenge her credibility in that moment. As a result, the case moved toward closure. The official determination leaned toward the interpretation that Daniel had taken his own life. While the method was unusual, it was not impossible. Without direct evidence pointing to another individual, the legal threshold required to pursue a homicide charge was not met. The investigation concluded with a finding that did not fully satisfy every question but aligned with what could be proven. Once again, Rachel Bennett stood at the center of a situation that ended without formal accusation. Following Daniel's death, the administrative process unfolded in a manner similar to what had occurred in 2001. Insurance claims were reviewed, documentation was processed, and the transfer of assets moved forward. Rachel became the beneficiary of Daniel's estate, inheriting what remained after his passing. The repetition of this outcome did not immediately trigger alarm within the system. Each case, viewed independently, followed a path that could be explained within its own context. But the pattern existed, even if it had not yet been formally recognized. Two husbands, two sudden deaths, two situations where the explanation relied on limited examination. At the time, these elements remained separated by circumstance. There was no active effort to connect them, no directive to compare the details across both timelines. The first case had been closed years earlier, and the second had now reached its own conclusion. For most people involved, the story ended there. Yet not everyone accepted that ending. Within the investigative team, there was at least one individual who did not find the conclusion sufficient. Detective Marcus Hale had followed the details of Daniel's case closely, and something about the structure of it did not align with the final determination. It was not a single piece of evidence that raised concern, but the overall pattern of how events had unfolded. The presence of antifreeze was one part of it. The existence of two glasses was another. The reliance on Rachel's explanation without contradiction created a scenario that felt incomplete. The conclusion of self-inflicted poisoning required a level of certainty that the available evidence did not fully support. Hale recognized that the case had reached its legal limit, but that did not resolve the underlying doubt. That doubt led him to look backward. He revisited the file from 2001, the case involving Thomas Bennett. At first, it appeared unrelated, categorized under natural causes and closed without complication. But as he examined the details, certain parallels began to emerge. The sudden nature of the death, the absence of an autopsy, the reliance on a surface-level explanation that had never been tested further. The connection was not yet proven, but it was enough to shift his focus. For the first time, the two chapters of Rachel Bennett's life were being viewed together rather than separately. What had once been isolated events now existed within the same frame. The possibility that they were linked introduced a new direction for the investigation, one that extended beyond the boundaries of the most recent case. At that point, nothing had been reopened. No formal action had been taken. The system still recognized both deaths as resolved. But the foundation of that resolution had begun to weaken. And once that process started, it would not stop until every assumption that supported those conclusions had been tested against what might have been missed the first time. Detective Marcus Hale did not move immediately, and that hesitation became part of the process that followed. In late 2005, after Daniel Harper's case had been formally closed, the system had already accepted its conclusion. Reopening anything would require justification that went beyond instinct. What Hale had at that point was not evidence, but a pattern that refused to settle into something reasonable. Two deaths, separated by 4 years, connected only by one person. The similarity was not obvious on paper. Thomas Bennett's death had been labeled as cardiac arrest. Daniel Harper's death had been attributed to antifreeze poisoning, interpreted as self-inflicted. Different causes, different classifications, different investigative paths. But when Hale examined them side by side, the differences began to lose weight, and the structure beneath them started to align. Sudden timing, controlled environments, limited examination, and at the center of both, Rachel Bennett. The first step was not to accuse but to verify. Hale returned to the file from 2001, reviewing it in full detail. He traced the original response, the medical conclusion, and most importantly, the absence of an autopsy. That absence stood out more clearly now than it had at the time. Without a full examination, the cause of death had been accepted without challenge, leaving open the possibility that something had been missed entirely. The question became unavoidable. If Daniel Harper had died from antifreeze, could Thomas Bennett have died the same way? There was only one method to answer that question with certainty, and it was a decision that carried weight far beyond a routine investigation. Exhumation is not a step taken lightly. It requires legal approval, justification, and the willingness to reopen a case that had already been closed for years. It also carries emotional consequences for the family, forcing the past back into the present in a way that cannot be undone. Hale moved forward with the request. The process required coordination with legal authorities and forensic specialists. The justification centered on the emergence of new information, specifically the confirmed poisoning in Daniel's case and the potential connection between the two deaths. After review, approval was granted. The case of Thomas Bennett was no longer considered fully resolved. The exhumation took place under controlled conditions. Forensic analysis began immediately, focusing on chemical traces that would not have been examined in 2001. The goal was precise: determine whether any toxic substances were present that could not have been detected through the original evaluation. The testing process required time, but the results, when they arrived, removed any remaining ambiguity. Antifreeze was present in Thomas Bennett's system. The discovery altered the entire foundation of the case. What had once been considered a natural death was now reclassified as poisoning. The gap left by the absence of an autopsy in 2001 had been filled, and the conclusion was no longer consistent with the original report. Two men, connected only through Rachel Bennett, had died from the same substance. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was confirmed. Despite that confirmation, the case did not immediately transform into a criminal charge. The presence of antifreeze established what had happened, but it did not establish who had caused it. In both cases, the substance had been consumed, but the mechanism of that consumption remained unproven. The evidence pointed toward a connection, but it did not yet cross the threshold required for prosecution. Hale understood that distinction. Suspicion had now been replaced with evidence of a shared method, but the critical element, direct responsibility, was still missing. The investigation shifted into a new phase, one that required precision rather than assumption. Every detail had to be re-examined, every statement reconsidered, every inconsistency brought into focus. Rachel Bennett became the central point of that process. Her previous statements were reviewed alongside the new findings. The explanation she had provided in Daniel's case, the denial of involvement, the account of the two glasses, all of it gained new significance when viewed against the confirmation that Thomas had also been poisoned. The consistency of her narrative now appeared less stable under the weight of that connection. The case began to narrow. Investigators focused on what could be proven rather than what could be suspected. The evidence needed to establish not only that the poison had been used, but that Rachel had been the one to introduce it. Without that link, the case would remain incomplete no matter how strong the pattern appeared. That realization defined the next step. Hale arranged for Rachel to be brought in for questioning again, this time under a different context. The investigation was no longer limited to Daniel Harper's death. It now included the reopened case of Thomas Bennett, supported by new forensic evidence that directly contradicted the original conclusion. The pressure had shifted. Rachel was no longer associated with two separate tragedies. She was now connected to two confirmed poisonings. The distance between those events had been eliminated, replaced by a single line that ran through both timelines. At that point, the investigation had reached a critical threshold. The evidence had revealed the method. The pattern had been established. The past had been reopened and redefined. What remained was the final element that would determine whether the case could move forward as a criminal prosecution. And that element would depend on what Rachel Bennett said next, and whether the version of events she had maintained could withstand the weight of everything that had now been uncovered. By the time Rachel Bennett sat down for questioning again, the context surrounding her had completely changed. This was no longer a conversation about a single event. It was no longer limited to Daniel Harper's death in August 2005. The investigation now carried the weight of two confirmed poisonings, separated by years but unified by one critical detail: antifreeze. Detective Marcus Hale approached the interview with a clear objective. He did not need Rachel to explain everything. He needed her to contradict herself. He needed something small, something precise, something that could not be dismissed as interpretation. The evidence already established a pattern. What remained was the moment that would connect Rachel directly to that pattern. The questioning began within familiar ground. Rachel repeated the same account she had provided before. She described preparing cranberry juice for Daniel. She maintained that she had no involvement with the antifreeze. Her statements followed the structure she had already used, consistent enough to appear reliable. From a legal standpoint, consistency can be a form of protection. As long as her version remained intact, it limited the ability of investigators to challenge her without direct contradiction. Hale focused on details. He returned to the evidence recovered from the bedroom. 2 glasses, one containing juice, one containing antifreeze. He presented a photograph taken during the initial investigation, placing both glasses within the same frame. The image did not introduce new information, but it concentrated attention on a single point of uncertainty. He asked Rachel to identify which glass she had prepared. The question was simple. It did not require speculation or reconstruction. It asked for a direct response tied to a detail she had already claimed to remember. The expectation was not that she would confess, but that she would reaffirm her earlier statement in a way that could be measured against the evidence. Rachel looked at the image. For a brief moment, the structure of her narrative shifted. She indicated one of the glasses and began to explain, but in the process, something changed. She referenced antifreeze before correcting herself to cranberry juice. The correction came immediately, almost reflexive, as if the initial word had surfaced without intention. The adjustment was quick, but it did not erase what had already been said. That single moment altered the entire trajectory of the case. What had been a controlled narrative now contained a fracture. The slip introduced a possibility that had not existed in her previous statements. Direct familiarity with the antifreeze in the context of the glasses. It was not a confession, but it was not neutral either. It created a contradiction between what she had claimed to know and what she had just revealed. Investigators recognized the significance immediately. In isolation, the statement might have been dismissed as a mistake. But within the context of two poisonings, it carried weight. It suggested knowledge that could not be easily explained by coincidence. It implied a connection between Rachel and the substance that had caused both deaths. Rachel attempted to recover. She clarified her statement, emphasizing that it had been a slip of the tongue. She accused the questioning of being misleading, suggesting that the pressure of the situation had caused her to misspeak. From her perspective, maintaining that explanation was essential. If the statement could be framed as accidental, its impact could be reduced. But the investigation had already shifted. Hale did not need her to repeat the statement. He needed it to exist. The interview was being observed and recorded, allowing every word to be reviewed in detail. The slip could be analyzed, compared, and presented alongside the physical evidence. It provided something that had been missing until that moment. A direct inconsistency tied to Rachel's own words. The pressure began to build. With the exhumation results confirming antifreeze in Thomas Bennett's system, and with Daniel Harper's death already attributed to the same substance, the case had moved beyond speculation. The slip added a new layer, one that connected Rachel's knowledge to the method used in both deaths. It narrowed the gap between possibility and proof. Rachel's response remained defensive. She rejected the implication that the statement reflected anything more than a verbal error. She maintained her original account, refusing to accept the interpretation being placed on her words. At that stage, admitting to anything would have immediately escalated the situation into a formal confession. Her position required complete denial. But the investigation no longer depended on her admission. The combination of forensic evidence and her own inconsistency created a foundation strong enough to move forward. It was not a single piece of evidence that defined the case, but the way each element reinforced the others. The poison, the pattern, the lack of alternative explanations, and now the slip, all of it converged into a single direction. Hale understood that the case had reached a turning point. The goal was no longer to determine whether something had happened. That had already been established. The goal was now to construct a sequence that could be presented in court, one that would withstand scrutiny and demonstrate intent beyond reasonable doubt. Every detail from that interview would become part of that structure. For Rachel Bennett, the space for uncertainty was shrinking. The explanation she had relied on for years was no longer sufficient to contain the evidence that had been uncovered. The consistency that once protected her had been broken by a single word, one that could not be taken back or redefined once it had been spoken. From that moment forward, the investigation moved with a new level of certainty. The pattern had been exposed. And the final phase, the one that would determine how far Rachel was willing to go to escape that pattern, was about to begin. By late 2005, the pressure surrounding Rachel Bennett had reached a level she could no longer ignore. The investigation had moved beyond suspicion and into a phase where every detail of her past was being re-examined. The connection between Thomas Bennett and Daniel Harper was no longer theoretical. It was supported by forensic evidence, reinforced by inconsistencies, and now anchored by a moment she could not take back. Rachel understood what that meant. The narrative she had relied on for years was collapsing under the weight of new information. The consistency that once protected her had been broken, and with that break came a shift in control. The investigation was no longer reacting to her version of events. It was actively challenging it, piece by piece, narrowing every possible explanation until only one direction remained. At that point, the situation demanded a response. Rachel needed a way to redirect the investigation, to introduce doubt where certainty was beginning to form. Without that, the case would continue to build against her, eventually reaching a point where denial would no longer be enough. The strategy she chose was not based on confrontation, but on redirection. She turned toward the one person who could be placed inside both timelines without immediately raising suspicion. Her daughter, Megan Bennett. Megan had lived through both phases of Rachel's life. She had been present during Thomas's death and had remained in the household through Rachel's second marriage. From an external perspective, she existed within the same environment where both poisonings had occurred. That proximity created an opportunity, one that Rachel decided to use. The plan began with a written statement. A confession, detailed and structured, appeared as a typed document. It described, in precise terms, the poisoning of both Thomas Bennett and Daniel Harper. The language presented Megan as the one responsible, outlining a method that aligned with the evidence already known to investigators. The level of detail was deliberate, designed to appear authentic, to match the facts closely enough that it could not be dismissed as fabrication. The document served a specific purpose. If accepted, it would redirect the investigation entirely. It would shift responsibility away from Rachel and place it onto someone whose presence in both timelines could be explained. It would introduce a new narrative, one that investigators would be required to examine before proceeding further. In a case built on connections, replacing the central figure could disrupt everything that had been established. But the confession alone was not enough. It needed context. Megan's condition became part of that context. Shortly after the document appeared, Megan was found in a state that suggested a medical emergency. The situation was presented as sudden and unexpected, reinforcing the idea that something significant had occurred. Rachel reported the incident, framing it as a discovery that supported the existence of the confession. The timing connected the two elements, creating a sequence that appeared intentional. From the outside, it resembled a resolution, a confession explaining both deaths, a critical event involving the person named in that confession, a narrative that could, if accepted, bring the investigation to a conclusion without further escalation. For a moment, the structure held together. But it did not hold for long. Megan survived. Her recovery introduced a factor Rachel had not accounted for. The confession depended entirely on its authenticity. Without Megan's confirmation, it remained a document without a source, vulnerable to scrutiny. Once Megan was able to respond, the foundation of the plan began to weaken. She denied writing the confession. Her statement removed the central support from Rachel's strategy. The document could no longer be treated as a voluntary admission. Instead, it became evidence of something else entirely. The focus shifted from what the confession claimed to who had created it. Investigators moved quickly. The document was examined not only for its content, but for its origin. It was typed, which meant it could be traced. Attention turned to the computer used to produce it, the system that stored drafts, timestamps, and records of activity. Unlike spoken words, digital evidence could not be retracted or explained away through interpretation. The results were definitive. Draft versions of the confession were found on Rachel's computer. The timestamps revealed a critical detail. The document had been created while Megan was not present. That single fact dismantled the entire narrative Rachel had attempted to construct. It proved that the confession could not have originated from Megan, and by extension, it pointed directly back to Rachel. The investigation reached a new level of clarity. What had once been a case built on patterns and inconsistencies now contained direct evidence of fabrication. The attempt to shift blame had instead reinforced the original suspicion, providing investigators with exactly what they needed to move forward. Rachel's position became untenable. The strategy that was meant to protect her had exposed her. The case was no longer about possibility. It was about proof. And for the first time since 2001, the system had everything it needed to act. By early 2009, the investigation that had once struggled to connect fragments had become a complete and undeniable case. Rachel Bennett was no longer positioned as a witness, nor as someone standing near a series of tragic events. She had become the central figure in a pattern that now carried legal weight, supported by forensic evidence, digital records, and her own failed attempt to redirect responsibility. The arrest followed a sequence that had been building for years. Law enforcement moved forward once the evidence reached a level that could withstand prosecution. The charges reflected the full scope of what had been uncovered: the murder of Thomas Bennett, the murder of Daniel Harper, and the attempted killing of her daughter, Megan Bennett. Each charge carried its own timeline, its own evidence, but together they formed a single narrative that the court would now examine in detail. For Rachel, the shift from investigation to prosecution marked the end of control. The structure she had relied on, silence, denial, and redirection, could no longer contain the case against her. Every detail that had once existed in isolation was now connected and presented in a way that left little room for reinterpretation. The absence of an autopsy in 2001, the presence of antifreeze in both victims, the slip during questioning, and the fabricated confession all aligned into a sequence that was no longer fragmented. The trial brought that sequence into focus. Prosecutors built their case methodically, relying not on a single piece of evidence but on the consistency of the entire pattern. They demonstrated how both men had died under similar circumstances, how the same substance had been used, and how Rachel had been the only constant presence across both timelines. The exhumation of Thomas Bennett became a critical turning point, transforming what had once been considered a natural death into confirmed poisoning. The digital evidence added another layer. The drafts of the confession letter, recovered from Rachel's computer, provided a direct link to her attempt to manipulate the outcome of the investigation. The timestamps removed any ambiguity, showing that the document had been created without Megan's involvement. That detail did more than disprove the confession. It revealed intent, a willingness to construct a false narrative even as the investigation closed in. Rachel maintained her denial. Her defense focused on the absence of direct observation, emphasizing that no one had witnessed her administering the poison. They questioned the interpretation of the evidence, suggesting alternative explanations where possible. But the strength of the prosecution's case did not depend on a single moment of observation. It depended on the accumulation of facts that pointed in one direction, repeatedly without contradiction strong enough to redirect them. The jury considered that accumulation. They reviewed the timelines, the forensic findings, the recorded statements, and the digital records. They examined the consistency of the pattern and the improbability of coincidence. Two separate deaths, both involving antifreeze, both occurring within Rachel's immediate environment, both initially explained in ways that avoided deeper scrutiny. The connection was no longer speculative. It was established. The verdict reflected that conclusion. Rachel Bennett was found guilty on all major counts. The court sentenced her to more than 50 years in prison, a term that effectively ensured she would spend the remainder of her life within the correctional system. The sentence marked the formal end of a case that had begun as something easily dismissed, something that did not initially demand attention. For Megan, the outcome carried a different weight. She had survived not only the attempt on her life, but also the realization that the threat had come from within her own family. The process of recovery extended beyond physical health. It required rebuilding trust, redefining identity, and understanding a past that had been shaped by deception. Her survival became a turning point, not just in the case, but in her own life moving forward. The community, too, absorbed the impact. What had once been viewed as separate tragedies was now understood as a deliberate pattern hidden beneath ordinary circumstances. The case forced a reconsideration of assumptions, particularly the idea that certain events are inherently simple, inherently explainable without deeper examination. It revealed how easily truth can be overlooked when it presents itself in familiar forms. In the end, the story did not conclude with a single moment. It closed gradually, as each piece of evidence settled into its place, as each question found its answer, and as the system that had once overlooked critical details corrected itself. The resolution was not immediate, and it was not simple. It required time, persistence, and the willingness to revisit what had already been accepted. What remained was a lesson that extended beyond the case itself. Truth does not always arrive with force. It often exists quietly, waiting in the details that seem too small to matter, in the questions that are set aside because they are inconvenient or difficult to pursue. The absence of doubt can sometimes be the most dangerous assumption, especially when it replaces the need to look closer. And in lives shaped by trust, the most important protection is not certainty, but the courage to question what appears certain, before silence has the chance to become something irreversible. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to this story today. Your attention and presence mean more than you may realize. Stories like this are not just about what happened, but about what we choose to learn from them. Behind every event lies a deeper lesson, a reminder that truth can sometimes hide beneath what appears ordinary, and that asking questions, even when everything seems settled, can make all the difference. This story reminds us that trust is something precious, but it should never replace awareness. In life, the smallest doubts, the quietest instincts, and the details we often overlook can hold the truth we need to see. It teaches us to stay thoughtful, to look beyond appearances, and to value honesty, responsibility, and care in every relationship we build. If this story has made you reflect, even for a moment, then it has already served its purpose. And if you would like to support our channel, it is very simple. Please consider liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful and thought-provoking stories like this to you. Once again, thank you for being here and for listening with an open mind.